Sophie Turner, a young police officer, started her day like any other. The city of Bloomfield, where she lived and worked, wasn't overly dangerous, but it had its fair share of incidents that kept the police busy. Sophie often began her shifts by patrolling the familiar streets where she had witnessed countless tragedies and stories throughout her 5-year career. That afternoon, while driving near the Central Park, Sophie noticed something unusual. A group of people had gathered on the side of the road, their faces filled with concern. She pulled over and quickly stepped out. "What's going on here?" she asked, her eyes scanning the crowd. A middle-aged woman pointed ahead to where an elderly black man lay unconscious on the sidewalk. "He collapsed a little while ago. We don't know what to do," the woman said, her voice anxious. Sophie immediately knelt beside the man. The sunlight highlighted the deep lines of age and hardship etched across his face. She checked his breathing and pulse. "He's still breathing," she assured the crowd, "but he needs to get to a hospital right away." Without hesitation, Sophie called for an ambulance. While waiting, she took off her jacket and draped it over the man to keep him warm. Though she didn't know him, she felt a strange sense of connection. When the ambulance arrived, Sophie helped the paramedics lift the man onto the stretcher. Amid the watchful eyes of the crowd, she climbed into the ambulance to ensure he would receive proper care. Little did she know, this small act of kindness would change her life forever. Sophie stepped into the hospital after the ambulance arrived, her eyes fixed on the elderly man being wheeled into the emergency room. The paramedics reassured her that he would be fine, but Sophie decided to stay, just to be sure. Sitting in the waiting area, she felt the strange stillness of the hospital, a quietness interspersed with the hum of machines and the hurried footsteps of nurses. Through the glass panel, she could faintly see the man behind the white curtains. Sophie wasn't the type to let her emotions dictate her actions, but this time, she felt she couldn't leave. After a few hours of waiting, a doctor came out. "He's going to be fine," the doctor said with a small smile. "Just exhaustion and dehydration. We'll keep him for observation." Sophie let out a sigh of relief. She scribbled her phone number on a piece of paper and handed it to the hospital staff, asking them to contact her if needed. Before leaving, she glanced back at the man through the glass, wondering who he was and what story had brought him here. By the time Sophie returned home, she had already missed dinner. Her small apartment in the city center was cluttered with maps, case files, and a few photos from past investigations. She switched on the small desk lamp and made herself a cup of tea. Sophie's life revolved around her job, but at times, she couldn't ignore the emptiness she felt. She had once dreamed of becoming a police officer not just to maintain order but to make a difference. Yet, the reality often left her exhausted and doubtful. That night, as Sophie lay in bed, she couldn't shake the image of the elderly man from her mind. The next morning, Sophie decided to return to the hospital to visit the elderly man. When she entered the room, she saw him sitting up in bed, his gaze distant as he looked out the window. "Good morning, sir," she said, trying to keep her tone as gentle as possible. He turned to her, his eyes briefly showing surprise before softening. "Good morning," he replied, his voice warm but weary. "I'm Sophie Turner. I was the one who brought you here yesterday." She introduced herself with a smile. The man nodded, his eyes reflecting a quiet gratitude. "Thank you, Sophie. My name is Samuel Robinson." Sophie sat down on the chair beside his bed and began asking about his health and family. However, Samuel was reserved, offering little detail. He mentioned only that he lived alone and had no family nearby. "You've made me curious," Sophie said, half joking. Samuel smiled faintly but didn't elaborate further. Before leaving, Sophie left her phone number and promised to help if he needed anything. Samuel watched her go, his eyes briefly flickering with an unreadable emotion. That day, Sophie returned to the police station to resume her duties. She became absorbed in the usual workload, but the story of Samuel lingered in her mind. During the afternoon meeting, Police Chief Marcus Robinson entered the room. Known for his stern demeanor and aloof personality, Marcus was someone Sophie respected for his sense of fairness. "We need to acknowledge acts of kindness in our community," Marcus said during the meeting. "I heard that Sophie Turner helped an elderly man on the street yesterday. I want to thank her for that." The room turned to look at Sophie, who smiled shyly, feeling slightly embarrassed by the attention. However, Sophie had no idea that the man she had helped was Marcus's father. In the days that followed, Sophie noticed Marcus seemed to take more interest in her work. He often asked about her progress and engaged her in discussions about community outreach projects. Sophie couldn't quite understand the sudden attention, but she had a growing sense that something bigger was happening, something she had yet to uncover. A few days later, Sophie unexpectedly received a call from the hospital. On the other end of the line was a nurse's voice. "Hello, Officer Turner. Mr. Samuel Robinson would like to see you. He's being discharged today." Surprised but intrigued, Sophie agreed to stop by. When she arrived, Samuel was already waiting outside the hospital in a worn coat. He smiled warmly when he saw her, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Officer Turner, I don't know how to thank you enough," Samuel said. "There's no need to thank me, Mr. Robinson," Sophie replied. "Helping others is my duty." Samuel nodded. "But not everyone stops to help. I've seen many people pass by without even a glance. You're different." Sophie didn't know how to respond. Samuel then suggested treating her to a cup of coffee as a way to express his gratitude. At first, Sophie declined, but his gentle persistence won her over. In a small cafe on the corner of the street, Samuel began sharing his life story. He once lived in a poor neighborhood, where he worked as a community leader. He helped children, organized gatherings to reduce violence, and brought people together. But life took a tragic turn when he lost his beloved wife and 2 children. "That was the hardest time of my life," Samuel admitted, his eyes distant. "I walked away from everything, left everyone behind. I couldn't bear to look back." Sophie felt a deep sadness in his words. Though she didn't know much about him, she sensed a strange and profound connection. In their subsequent meetings, Samuel opened up more about his past. He shared that he had once been a devoted father, but after losing his wife, he fell into depression. His relationship with his son, Marcus, grew increasingly distant. "Marcus, he couldn't understand why I gave up. He thinks I'm a coward," Samuel said, his voice rough with emotion. Sophie was taken aback. "Marcus? Do you mean Chief Marcus Robinson?" Samuel nodded silently. Sophie froze in surprise. She had never imagined that this man was the father of the police chief, a figure she deeply respected. "Then why don't you talk to him? I'm sure Marcus still cares about you," Sophie urged. Samuel gave a sad smile. "Time has fractured our relationship. I feel like I no longer have a place in his life." Sophie didn't know what to say. She felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility to do something to help mend the rift between them. At the same time, Sophie found herself grappling with a complex case involving racial discrimination. A young black man had been arrested on suspicion of robbery, but as Sophie delved deeper into the investigation, she realized he was simply a victim of misunderstanding. She tried to persuade her colleagues to re-examine the case, but not everyone agreed. Some at the police station accused her of being too soft. "Turner, this is the job. Sometimes we have to be tough," one colleague said. Sophie was angry but couldn't immediately respond. She knew that such bias was deeply ingrained in the system, but she couldn't bring herself to accept it. As she pondered how to resolve the situation, Sophie remembered Samuel's stories about his fight for justice in the community. His experiences gave her the strength to push forward. After gathering enough evidence, Sophie presented the case to Police Chief Marcus Robinson. At first, Marcus was cautious, but faced with Sophie's unwavering determination, he agreed to take another look. "Turner, I hope you know what you're doing," Marcus said. "Sir, I just want to do what's right." Sophie replied, her eyes resolute. A few days later, the case was resolved in favor of the young man who had been wrongfully accused. Sophie received praise from both her colleagues and the community. But the most unexpected reaction came from Marcus Robinson. "You did well, Turner," he said during a meeting. "We need more people like you in this department." The compliment from Marcus took Sophie by surprise and moved her deeply. It was the first time she felt genuine support from someone in a position of authority. After the meeting, Marcus called Sophie into his office. "Turner, I want to thank you for helping me realize something important. Sometimes, we need to listen and truly understand what's happening instead of just looking at the surface," Marcus said. Sophie hadn't expected Marcus to open up like that. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Chief Robinson, there's someone I think you should reconnect with." Marcus frowned. "Who?" Sophie hesitated again, then replied, "Your father, Samuel Robinson." The atmosphere in the room grew heavy. Marcus stared at Sophie as though she had just said something unbelievable. "He's still around?" Marcus asked, his voice quiet. "Yes, I've met him, and he misses you very much," Sophie said, trying to keep her tone calm. Marcus remained silent for a long time. "I'll think about it." As Sophie left the office, she felt a mix of relief and worry. She hoped that Marcus would open his heart and find a way to mend his relationship with his father. After her tense conversation with Chief Marcus Robinson, Sophie felt a mix of relief and worry. She knew she had stepped into a story far more complex than she had anticipated. But she had no regrets, believing that the fragmented pieces of this father-son relationship needed to be reconnected. A few days later, Sophie received a call from Samuel. He asked if they could meet at the park, where he often sat to watch people pass by. Sophie agreed without hesitation. When she arrived, she saw Samuel sitting on an old wooden bench under a large oak tree. He held a book in his hands, but his eyes were fixed on the children playing on the grass. "Sophie, thank you for coming," he said when he noticed her. "There's no need to thank me, Mr. Samuel. I'm happy to talk with you," she replied, taking a seat beside him. They began to talk about many things: the weather, favorite books, and stories from life. Samuel shared that he always found joy in watching children play, as they reminded him of Marcus's childhood. "He used to love this park," Samuel said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "We had so many memories here, but things changed so quickly." Sophie listened intently, sensing the deep longing and regret in his words. She started to see Samuel not just as a lonely old man, but as a father carrying the heavy burden of remorse. One late evening, after finishing her shift, Sophie sat in her office reviewing case files from recent investigations. Yet her thoughts kept drifting to Samuel and Marcus. Their strained relationship made her reflect on her own life. While her family's story wasn't as complicated, it had its own gaps she hadn't figured out how to mend. Sophie decided to dig deeper into the relationship between Marcus and Samuel. Discreetly, she asked a few trusted colleagues and uncovered some important details. It turned out that Marcus had grown up in a challenging environment. After his mother's death, he became the family's backbone at a young age. He had always felt that Samuel abandoned his responsibilities, leaving him to bear the weight of it all. Despite his professional success, Marcus had never entertained the idea of forgiving his father. Sophie's heart ached as she learned these stories. She wasn't sure how to help them, but she understood that only sincerity and time could begin to heal the wounds they carried. After several meetings, Samuel began to open up more to Sophie. One afternoon, they took a walk around the old neighborhood where he used to live. Samuel pointed out houses and small shops, sharing stories of his past life. "This is where Marcus grew up," he said, gesturing toward a small house with faded walls. "We had some very happy times here, but everything changed after my wife passed away. I couldn't handle the pain." He paused, his eyes heavy with emotion. "I left Marcus behind. I didn't think I could be a good father to him. But looking back now, I realize I made a mistake. Sophie placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. Saying nothing, she understood that Samuel needed to say these things to lighten the weight on his heart. "I don't know if Marcus can ever forgive me," Samuel said quietly. "You don't need to know that right now," Sophie replied. "What matters is that you're willing to try. Marcus needs to know that you still care about him." The conversation with Samuel made Sophie reflect on her own family. Her parents, who had once been so close to her, now seemed distant. Sophie often blamed work and her busy schedule. But deep down, she knew she hadn't tried hard enough to maintain their relationship. One evening, Sophie decided to call her mother. The conversation started off brief and formal, but gradually, they began talking more. Sophie realized that reconnecting wasn't as hard as she had imagined. Samuel, with his calm demeanor and life experience, became something of a spiritual mentor for Sophie. He encouraged her to confront the pain of the past and to open her heart to her loved ones. When Sophie shared stories about her family with Samuel, he responded with a gentle smile. "You'll never know what you can change unless you try," he said. Those words became a source of motivation for Sophie. She resolved to help Samuel and Marcus mend their relationship. Even though she knew it would be anything but easy, Sophie decided it was time for Samuel and Marcus to meet again. She knew, however, that this wouldn't be an easy reunion. With patience and determination, she approached each of them, working to create the best possible conditions for their meeting. When Sophie brought up the idea to Samuel, he hesitated. "You don't understand, Sophie. I've hurt Marcus too much. He has every reason to hate me." "No, Mr. Samuel," Sophie replied, her eyes resolute. "I've spoken with Marcus, and I know he doesn't hate you. He's just in pain. You need to give him the chance to say what he truly feels." Marcus, on the other hand, was equally difficult to convince. When Sophie suggested arranging a meeting, he frowned. "I don't think there's anything left to say to him," Marcus said coldly. "Chief Robinson," Sophie responded. "Sometimes what we think is too late is actually the exact moment it's needed most. Samuel has changed, and I believe he deserves a chance to make things right." Eventually, Marcus agreed. Though reluctantly, Sophie arranged for the meeting to take place at Samuel's favorite park, where he often watched children playing. When the day came, the atmosphere in the park felt unusually still. Samuel sat on a bench, his eyes fixed on the pathway, while Marcus stood a short distance away, his hands clenched as if debating whether to proceed. "He's waiting for you," Sophie said softly, placing a hand on Marcus's shoulder. Marcus took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Dad," Marcus said, his voice quiet but laden with emotion. Samuel turned, his eyes glistening as he saw his son. "Marcus." At first, they simply stared at each other, as though words were insufficient to capture their emotions. But then, Marcus sat down beside his father. They began to talk, first in short sentences, then in longer exchanges about the past, their pain, and their regrets. From a distance, Sophie watched, her heart swelling with hope. This was just the beginning, but she knew it would pave the way for a new chapter for both of them. The story of Marcus and Samuel's reunion not only spread within the police department but also caught the attention of local media. A local newspaper wrote about Sophie's actions in helping Samuel and facilitating the father-son reconciliation. While the article received widespread praise, it also sparked some criticism. Some questioned Sophie's role. Should a police officer be interfering in the personal matters of the police chief? The negative comments added to Sophie's sense of pressure. At the station, a few colleagues began treating her with noticeable hostility. "Turner, are you trying to be a hero or something?" One colleague sneered. Sophie didn't respond, but inside, she felt conflicted and unsure. She began to question whether she had done the right thing. When Samuel learned about Sophie's struggles, he called her. "Sophie, I know this is a tough time for you, but remember that doing the right thing is rarely easy. You've given Marcus and me a chance, and that means more than anything else." Samuel's words gave Sophie renewed strength. She resolved to ignore the negativity and focus on her work. Knowing she had made a real difference, Sophie continued to work diligently, and her contributions could not go unnoticed. During an important meeting at the police department, Marcus Robinson publicly praised Sophie in front of her colleagues. Officer Turner is not only an outstanding officer but also a person of great compassion. Her actions have not only improved our work, but also brought positive change to the community, Marcus said. Marcus's words took Sophie by surprise. It was the first time she felt fully recognized for her efforts. Not long after, Sophie was promoted to a higher position, giving her the opportunity to be involved in community outreach projects she had always dreamed of. However, the promotion didn't come without its challenges, as some colleagues harbored resentment. A senior colleague, who had always looked down on Sophie, remarked, "You got promoted just because the chief favors you." Sophie didn't let the comment affect her. She knew her advancement was a result of her hard work and dedication, and she remained focused on making a difference. The relationship between Marcus and Samuel continued to improve. They began spending more time together, from simple dinners to working on community projects. One evening, Marcus brought his father to a major charity event hosted by the police department. It was the first time Samuel appeared in public alongside his son. During his speech, Marcus said, "Tonight, I want to thank not only my team but also someone special who has taught me that forgiveness is one of the most powerful gifts we can give each other. That person is my father, Samuel Robinson." Samuel was deeply moved, his eyes reflecting the pride he had held back for so long as he looked at his son. When the event ended, Samuel pulled Sophie aside. "You didn't just save me, Sophie. You saved my family." Sophie smiled, her heart filled with warmth. She realized that sometimes, seemingly small actions could change the course of many lives. The reconciliation between Marcus and Samuel not only transformed their lives, but also brought a renewed sense of hope to the community. Marcus and Sophie began discussing the idea of launching a charitable initiative to improve living conditions in the city's underprivileged neighborhoods, especially those that had long been neglected. Samuel, with his experience and insight, volunteered to serve as an advisor. The project, named Light of Hope, focused on providing education, healthcare, and community activities to break down discrimination and create equal opportunities for everyone. The first meeting took place at a small community center. Despite his age, Samuel was brimming with energy as he spoke to the attendees. He shared his personal story, a tale of loss, regret, and reconciliation. "It's never too late to make things right," he said. "We all have the opportunity to become better people. And if I can do it, so can you." Samuel's heartfelt words left the room in silence. Many were moved by his sincerity and agreed to support the project. Sophie felt a profound sense of happiness as she saw the community beginning to change. This was her dream, a dream she thought would take a lifetime to achieve. But now, it was becoming a reality. During her time working on the project, Sophie grew closer to a colleague named Ryan Mitchell. Ryan was a quiet but dedicated officer, always supportive of Sophie's decisions. One late afternoon, as they were inspecting an old housing complex for renovation plans, Ryan unexpectedly asked, "Sophie, why do you care so much about this community? Not every cop thinks like you." Sophie looked at him, smiling gently, "Because I've seen things most people don't want to see. I've witnessed loss, suffering, and injustice. If I can change something, even just a little, I think it's worth doing." Ryan nodded, his eyes reflecting admiration. "I think I understand why people respect you. And I do too." Ryan's words made Sophie blush. It was the first time in years she felt someone truly understood and cared about her. Working together brought them closer, though neither of them said it outright. They both felt a special connection growing between them. Ryan became Sophie's biggest source of encouragement, helping her stay grounded when the pressures of her work felt overwhelming. The Light of Hope project quickly achieved remarkable results. Forgotten neighborhoods now had new community centers where children could learn and play. Adults could attend vocational training, and everyone could feel the support of a revitalized community. Sophie received numerous invitations to speak at conferences and workshops to share her experiences. However, she felt her on-the-ground work remained her top priority. One day, during a meeting with Marcus, Samuel, and the project team, Sophie made an important announcement. "I've thought about this for a long time, and I've decided to leave the police force to focus entirely on this project. This is what I feel I need to do to truly make a difference." The room fell silent. Marcus was the first to speak. "Officer Turner, we'll greatly miss you in the force, but I support your decision. You've accomplished more than any of us, and I have no doubt you'll continue to succeed." Samuel reached out to hold Sophie's hand, his eyes glowing with pride. "Sophie, you've changed my life, and I know you'll change the lives of so many others." Ryan, who had been standing quietly by Sophie's side, didn't say a word, but his eyes were filled with pride and understanding, as though he already knew and supported the path she was about to take. A year later, the Light of Hope project had become a symbol of positive change within the community. Now serving as the executive director of the initiative, Sophie worked tirelessly to expand its reach, bringing hope to other underserved areas of the city. Samuel continued as a spiritual advisor, frequently attending events to share his story. Marcus, though busy with his duties as police chief, made time to support the project. Father and son had found the understanding and bond they once thought impossible. Sophie and Ryan had officially become a couple. Ryan stood steadfastly by Sophie's side through every challenge, serving as her loyal partner and unwavering supporter. During a ceremony celebrating the project's success, Sophie stood on stage, looking out at the radiant faces in the crowd. Samuel, Marcus, Ryan, and many others were present, each carrying a story of transformation. "We have proven that a small act of kindness can create a profound impact," Sophie said, her voice full of emotion, "and we will continue to bring this light to the places that need it most." The applause that followed was a resounding affirmation of all they had accomplished. Standing there, Sophie felt a warm wave of energy sweep over her. She knew the journey ahead would be long, but she no longer feared it. She had found the true meaning of her life, and she would continue spreading the light of hope wherever she went.